BSHF 101 Unit 29. The question of environment. Every day we get to hear depressing news about the environment going from bad to worse. If, for example, you open the newspaper The Hindu, 12th December 2005, we have the following warning: that the Gulf Stream is threatened, that the Greenland ice cap is melting faster than predicted, that last decade was the warmest for the last millennium, and that the world's oceans are warming at a dangerous rate. The same newspaper, of course, brings us the good news of 150 nations signing an agreement at the Montreal Conference on Climate Change to cut down emissions of poisonous gases, which have been making the world unlivable. In a matter of speaking, the above sums up the environment question the human beings are facing today. Environment meaning: the world of human beings, the flora and the fauna living in and around us are the natural resources which constitute Panch Mahabhuta. These are the five elements of nature: land, water, fire, air, and sky, which provide daily needs of life. As Gandhiji had observed, nature has enough to meet our needs, but not our greed, which is always insatiable. But unfortunately, exploitation of nature for commercial benefits has disturbed this precious balance which has held our humanity together. What passes off as economic development has largely been a consequence of ecological degradation, which has been uniquely caused all over the world. Actually, the main fuel which made industrial development possible during the last couple of centuries is fossil based, and that is also the major source of pollution of water and air. The benefits of such development, as we know, are reaped by the rich and industrially developed countries, while the consequences of pollution are borne by the poor and the developing countries. The type of development had a deep impact on our minds, so much so that education on environment has only recently surfaced as the degradation of ecology has increased for most of the humanity living in the developing countries. After some years of struggle both at the grassroots level, example goes the Chipko movement, Narmada Bachao Andolan, etc., and the judiciary, the Supreme Court of India has given a visionary direction to introduce environment as a compulsory subject from the academic year 2004 to 5 at all levels of education, school, university, and professional. Viewed from this perspective, we can see and also account for costs the humanity has to pay for an education which has remained confined to studies of human being alone. Education hitherto has been anthropocentric as it ignored ecocentric linkages. A balanced view of education takes humans and their environment as inseparable. The most authoritative statement on this line of reasoning has been given by the pioneer in the field, Rachel Carson, whose famous book Silent Spring opens with the best definition of environment. The history of life on earth has been a history of interaction between living things and their surroundings. Environment simply means the surroundings comprising the living and non-living, and the study of interactions between these two is the science of ecology. Study of ecology is essential because in the words of futurologist Sir Aldous Huxley, it is only by means of the science of life, ecology at that time was a branch of science of life, that the quality of life can be radically changed. Importance of environment education. Environment or ecology is essentially a field or case-based subject, and hence generation of familiarity with the world of one's surroundings should be an important aim of such education. It is a complex and an interrelated subject. Though important, it is not enough to learn only about tree plantation, waste management, water pollution, conservation of flora and fauna. A serious student of environment should at the same time be conversant with diverse interrelated changes, which are not directly visible but capable of impacting the environment considerably. These phenomena, which should also be studied, relate to demographic changes, availability of fodder, energy, raw material costs, and consequences of economic development, utilization of new technologies, so on and so forth, which affects the livelihood system among people. A true student of environment need to be an activist who is learning through doing, which is vitally at stake is the change of mindset, which is best introduced at the level of the child education. Those who are truly dedicated to such activism can take a leaf from the success story of Plachimanda Panchayat functionaries in Kerala who dared a multinational corporation, the Hindustan Coca-Cola Beverages Private Limited, and stopped the latter from pumping water for commercial use. Importantly, the court have increasingly applied the doctrine of public trust in disposing of cases arising out of privatization of natural resources. This doctrine rests on the principle that certain resources like air, sea, water, and forests have such a great importance to the people as a whole that it would be wholly unjustified to make them a subject of private ownership. In other words, we can now safely say that the public has a right to expect certain lands and natural areas to retain their natural characteristics to be protected by the state in the interest of general people against any attempt by some powerful moneyed groups to privately occupy. You should note the Supreme Court's view AIR 1988 in the MC Mehta versus Union of India, which are having regard to the need for protecting and improving the environment, which is considered a fundamental duty under the Constitution. It is the duty of central government to direct all the educational institutions to teach at least 1 hour a week lesson relating to the protection and improvement of the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife. In the first 10 classes, realizing the significance of environment education, the government has introduced it in the school's curricula. Environmental reform initiatives in India. As a civilization with hoary traditions, India have learned to adjust with the nature as a matter of living habit. Some of the survivals of the ancient practices, example goes non-killing of animals among Bishnois or worshipping of people tree or cow as Go Mata, etc., do indicate our environment-friendly approaches in the living style. But the advent of industrialization, especially without systematic planning, has made life miserable. However, the government's leadership, ably supported by green judicial interventions, has made life once again livable with the introduction of environmental reforms following global initiatives. The United Nations Conference on Human Environment was convened at Stockholm in 1972, and this pioneering global initiative laid down the basics of environmental reform to be followed in signatory countries including India. A. Man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. And B. Man bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. The Stockholm Declaration was adopted by UN General Assembly on 15 December 1972, which designated June 5th as the World Environment Day. All the countries are required to reaffirm on the day their pledge to conserve and improve the environment. This applies to all of us. Ms. Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, had participated in Ms. Indira Gandhi. It was settled on 72. Yes. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, had participated in that conference, and that she was sufficiently inspired by these developments because became clear when the provisions regarding protection of environment was incorporated into the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act passed in 1976. This appears as Article 48A in the chapter on Directive Principles of State Policy, which reads as below. Protection and improvement of environment and safeguarding of forests and wildlife. The state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. Apart from these provisions, a new provision in the form of fundamental duties as Article 51A was also incorporated by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment. Subclause G of this article is important, and it provides, it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. The Wildlife Protection Act was followed by the Water Act 1974, Forest Act 1981. There is no dearth of legal enactments to protect the environment, but the implementation of legislative provisions has either been slow or a non-starter. It was the Bhopal gas disaster of 3rd December 1984, in which over 3,500 people were killed and as many as 2 lakhs were injured, and the victims are fighting till date for healthcare facilities and compensation. That participated the passage of Environment Act in 1986. Even this act finds it difficult to provide relief to the affected people. That is where the Indian judiciary has effectively stepped in and ordered closure of dangerous limestone quarries, tanneries, shifting of hazardous industries operating in residential area of Delhi, so on and so forth in the course of disposal of public interest litigation cases. Post-Rio progress and appraisal. The principles and objectives laid down by the Stockholm resolution were confirmed by the Rio de Janeiro summit on June 14, 1992, also known as the Earth Summit, which adopted the new famous Rio de Declaration and its plan of action, popularly known as Agenda 21, and the Declaration on Principles of Forests. The head of governments who attended the Earth Summit proclaimed that there shall be sustainable development and the environmental issues are best handled with the participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant levels. The post-Rio program was reviewed in the World Summit on Sustainable Development held at Johannesburg in 2002. A close examination of Rio Summit's performance reveals that it remained far from becoming an earth-friendly conversation, which it was originally intended. This failure can be explained mainly in terms of non-performance of many treaties and conventions signed in its aftermath, which again was due to the conflict of interests between the rich industrial countries of the north and natural resources rich countries of the south. We need to understand some of these focal problems of environment which have reversed the direction of reforms towards ecological globalization. In other words, the best intentions are as outlined in these treaties and conventions were defeated by a defiant USA and the and the other rich countries taking shelter behind it in order to safeguard their industrial elites. The most important environmental concern relates to the dangerously increasing phenomenon of global warming. Burning of fossil fuels has been the driving force of industrialization. It also has been the major source of emissions of carbon dioxide, which along with other gases like chlorofluorocarbons trap the sun rays in the atmosphere and heat up the earth like a greenhouse. These GHCs, greenhouse gases with carbon dioxide component close to half of the total, are the main fuel for global warming. If these emissions are not stopped, there is a fear that A. There will be severe incidents of droughts and flood, and B. The sea level will rise and submerge a good part of low-lying countries like the Maldives, Bangladesh, etc. In order to meet this danger, a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed by 154 countries at the Rio Summit in 1992. After protracted negotiations, industrialized countries agreed to reduce their emissions in the period 2008 to 12 period by 5.2% compared to 1990 levels. This is the famous Kyoto Protocol, which has been signed by majority of the countries but not by USA and Australia prominently. Similar fate fell to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which President George Bush refused to sign at the 1992 Rio Summit. The CBD recognizes the rights of countries on their genetic resources and insists on fair and equitable return for the use of these resources, mostly by the pharmaceutical companies of the north. Recognition of the rights of ownership of these generic resources for the indigenous communities is a major feature of CBD, which has been ratified by more than 175 countries today. 80% of world's biological resources exists in the forests of the south. The north want unrestricted access to these forests for raw material for their drug production, which is approximately $43 billion a year. Tropical deforestation is a fast increasing owing to large scale falling of trees for logs. Forests of South are preying grounds for the multinationals of the North, which wants a convention to protect its timber trade interests, but not because they are a lifeline for people inhabiting these lands. The struggle is still going on to have an international convention on sustainable forestry. Though Rio Summit had called for it as a part of its global sustainable development goal. Similarly, the UN Convention to combat desertification, which was adopted by the Rio Summit in 1992, is similarly faced with problems as the northern countries are unwilling to accept desertification as anything more than a local problem caused by population pressures. Desertification affects 41% of the total land area on the earth and affects livelihood of more than 1 billion people, mostly in Africa, in more than 110 countries. The northern countries are unwilling to provide any assistance to the southern countries in this matter. This is, however, not the case with the environmental concerns affecting the northern hemisphere. Whether it is the hole in the ozone layer which was found to cause cancer, particularly to the white skin, or the problem of persistent organic pollutants (POPs) traveling to the Arctic. The governing Montreal Protocol and the negotiations on POPs respectively have been administered both in time with the full force. However, treaties on biological diversity and desertification, which deal mostly with problems in developing countries, have been stalled. This is symptomatic of ecological globalization, which the governments of the world are promoting through drive on the part of the rich and passive indifference on the part of countries from south. One of the leading actors from the India, the Center of Science and Environment, has identified these changes ahead of us. Challenges ahead. Though Western civil society and public concern have largely driven the global green agenda, governments have taken over the business in the post-Rio dynamics. The civil society, which led governments to take action in Rio, has since then merely followed the inaction of the governments. Thus, governmentalization of the environmental agenda is proving to be disastrous, as it has become a cause without a concern. Hardly any treaty signed in Rio or thereafter has been implemented with any seriousness. Agenda 21, Rio's plan of action, has almost become a dead document. Any discussion, particularly on with any trace of idealism, is quickly suppressed as inimical to all embracing quagmire of bureaucratic and economic pragmatism. To change this state of affair, the civil society, both of North and the South, has to show courage and develop the ability to keep governments accountable and responsive. Let the active and conscious citizens of the world ask for an equal share in the per capita entitlements of the global commons, like the resources of atmosphere and ocean, and not allow more than that to anybody, howsoever powerful. Both the past history and the future potentials can be factored in such as calculation of sustainable development. That is how the most widely accepted definition of sustainable development, offered by the Brundtland Land Commission report, can become workable. Development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of generations to meet their own needs. Despite this widely accepted definition, sustainable development has become a distant cry, largely because of a hypocritical approach to the problem adopted by the powerful countries. Next war, many say, is not going to be fought for border security. It is going to be for water that is becoming scarce. Already the Greenpeace has launched movements to expose the military build-ups rising around the sites of environmental degradation. Two major steps have already been taken by the global community to preserve and promote environmental sustainability, that is to say, not to destroy environment to an extent that may cause problems for safe living of the generations to be born. Firstly, the UN system has realized the importance of a clean environment. The UN Commission on Human Rights has, for the first time in 2001, has clearly declared that every individual has a right to live in a clean environment. Secondly, environmental sustainability has been accepted by the global community as one of the 8 Millennium Development Goals to be specifically attended to by all the governments of the world on top priority. Summary. In this unit, we explained to you the meaning of the term environment. The fact that there is a global environment crisis is widely acknowledged now. The tsunami of 2004 was definitely a grim reminder. Consequently, we have seen that over the past decade or so, there have been various global initiatives to tackle phenomena such as global warming. These initiatives have fallen victim to governmentalism. We point out that to move out of the stalemate, this governmentalism has led us into the civil society. Both the North and South have to take a courageous initiative and take effect to make governments accountable and responsive. Another important issue is environmental sustainability, that is to be key priority of the governments of the world.